This is 11 honors, and we're doing some background on Robert Louis Stevenson and the book The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I won't name any names, but some of my students don't know anything about it, which is fine.
Yeah, Isabella.
That's fine that they don't. So let me continue. I think I usually start with questions. You will need to know these, so I suggest you write this part down. This is a good way to study for a test. What are some unconventional aspects of Stevenson's life? What are some of his most popular works of literature? I mentioned two earlier. Why did he travel? He traveled particularly by boat, which was the only way to travel in those days, really. But he traveled by sailboat, and I think he may have owned one, in the Pacific Ocean. You'll find out he has an interesting connection with the South Pacific. When and where was Stevenson born? Any of you know what country Stevenson is from?
I don't know.
Well, you're close. It's Scotland.
I was just gonna start guessing.
That's why we call him a British writer.
Did you say Iceland?
Iceland?
Year. I don't even remember why I thought that.
This year is
Really stupid. I know. Was when we were doing Frankenstein, and I thought the North and South were like the same. Which doesn't make sense at all.
You now know which direction.
I thought like on the globe, like so, because like it shows it like flat, like the North and the South were just the same. So like the North Pole was actually just the South Pole. They just called it. They were like, I thought Antarctica was the North and the South Pole, and they just like cut it in half. Everything makes so much more sense now.
And when was this that you knew that?
This morning, not this morning. Earlier when we did Frankenstein.
Oh.
That's where I was.
Have you been at Caldwell your entire career?
No.
Oh wow.
It's because
Did
Caldwell
you-
didn't teach me that.
Did you think that for like
My
your
entire
life?
And that's why I was like, well, don't penguins live on like both sides?
There are two poles, right?
I got that now.
How did you?
That's why I was confused where Santa was.
It's
Because
a
I thought it was
road.
the same.
Science. Santa isn't anywhere.
All right, so
In
you
my
also need to
heart.
know, his reputation as a writer. These are good
Oh,
questions to write down because they're questions I'll ask you. And the audience that he appealed to. There are certain themes and characteristics that it's helpful. If they have Walt Whitman, I mean, all of you will be in college, you'll study next year some things, but if you know names, if you know a little background, it's helpful. All right, so how was hypocrisy? That was one of his themes, and how was it a major focus of the novel? It would be great, maybe this would have been a good thing to add to this, a little more background on the Victorian period. Like what do you know about Queen Victoria and the era that she lived?
She had
It
9
is-
children.
She what?
She had 9 children.
Very interesting. What other stories share with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde the motive of the double? That is one of the themes here, kind of an odd theme, but there's a number of books that have that in it, that there's a character who has almost an identical character. they order them from Barnes and Noble.
I was gonna say, it looks like Barnes and Noble cover. Someone who reads all the time. I really do know.
You know, I've told you this before, you will want your children, when that time comes, to be readers. And it will be hard to convince them to do so if you don't develop into one yourself. I think they will more likely to read if they see you reading. If they never see you reading, why would they want to?
My kid will not be an iPad
My
kid.
kid is gonna have,
Like the struggles I did.
are you saying you were an iPad kid?
Can we move on?
I'm saying I wasn't allowed, the only game I could play on my mom's phone was checkers. And,
All right,
like,
so
football.
let's look at Stevenson. I mean, this is just a very surface, very brief summary of the man's life. He was a poet. He wrote a book called A Child's Garden of Verse, which I can remember having copies when I was a kid, or we gave to our children. I didn't, you know, he wrote for children. He was a novelist. This is a good example. He was an essayist. He wrote short stories, and he wrote travel stories. That's a genre we don't get anymore, but Mark Twain wrote a couple of travel stories. That was a real popular genre. People didn't travel like they do now. They don't travel overseas to exotic places. So, you know, the travel story was an escape. You could read about these places because you probably never go there. He was a romantic, even though he lived in the era of realism. He was an adventurer and a world traveler. He had a conventional lifestyle and moral code. We'll see that. It's nothing all that sensational about our standards today. And maybe it was worse, that I don't know, but he rejected his Calvinist background, being a Presbyterian, being Scottish. That was, I guess, the major religious influence was Presbyterianism, and that was influenced by Calvin. He rejected all that, and he condemned hypocrisy in society. Well, good for him. Because hypocrites are not good. We're all hypocrites in some degree or another. We don't live up to our standards. But anyway, that's a little bit about him. And there's a little more.
Oh, I get the cover now.
Yeah, they're, see, I did split.
Okay, has everyone got this? Okay.
Sorry.
Born in 1850, that's 12 years before Thoreau died, to give you some perspective. Thoreau went into Walden Pond in 1845, so that was happening about the time he was a child. Born in Edinburgh, it's usually pronounced, not Edinburgh, but Edinburgh. It's spelled that way, but it's not pronounced that way. Scotland, his father was a civil engineer and designer of lighthouses. I think that's a cool thing. And as a child, he often accompanied his father to visit fishermen and lighthouse keepers, and probably developed tuberculosis as a result. That's what killed him eventually. And he spent the rest of his life treating it. That's why he became a world traveler, because he had to get out of the cold air of Scotland and travel in the South Pacific in order to treat his tuberculosis. John Keats was also died of tuberculosis. He was 27. embarrassing, isn't it, to pick one of you out?
No, I think you should just give us all.
Yeah, but what if I'm not allowed to? What if say you gotta pick one?
I
One of
will-
you is better than all the others.
I will debate with Caldwell, so
Do it.
everyone gets
Do
it.
it to the honor council or
I think it's
something.
only fair. It's fine.
That is way off topic here. It's interesting.
I don't really know why that came to my brain, but it did.
All right, talking about reading, he had a childhood nurse who encouraged him to read. And he dedicated that book, A Child's Garden of Verses, to her. And I've told you my story about the guy at college. It took a peer, it took someone my age to model and encourage me to be a reader. I was a freshman, junior, sophomore, junior in college, senior, I guess all 4 years. But he was a reader, and he encouraged me to read, and so I did. My parents tried to encourage me to read. They were not readers at the time. They later became more read. So here he has a childhood nurse who one-on-one encouraged him to read. I think that's sort of significant. He went to the university in Edinburgh, first to study engineering and then law, but ended up really doing neither of those things. He started to rebel in college. And so he passed the bar exam, but he didn't, I don't think he ever practiced law. So he passed the bar, so he's smart. He passed the bar exam, and he decided to travel, in part we know because of his health. He falls in love with a married woman. Here's where you get just a glimpse, a short glimpse of his unconventional lifestyle. She was traveling in Europe, and she was still married, and she was older than him. He did not marry her until she was divorced, but he did eventually marry her. But that didn't seem to be an obstacle, the fact that she was married to either one of them. And then he published travel books there that you may or may not have ever heard before.
That's a very What is the bar thing?
Wait, when is the quarter over?
Next Friday.
Friday, week from today. And that test you took yesterday will be there'll be 3 tests on the quarter.
Are you gonna take that one?
That's got a drop one.
Oh.
But I need to be reminded of it, which you just did.
Oh, the one that we all failed?
Yeah.
Drop Lois.
Osborne.
He's just like me.
Did you see what's on my Insta message page?
I knew I texted on the group chat and you didn't tell me. Did you?
Oh, that's because I started screaming at soccer.
Did y'all play yesterday?
No, it was just practice. I read your text and I ran around the field in anger
Why?
because he's not marrying me.
I've been dating since like 2019.
He's not marrying me.
Tom Hiddleston.
You know, all this is being recorded.
Good. I'll make sure to go back and screen record just this part. Maybe Tom Hiddleston will see it and realize.
The relationship with the woman represents his unconventional lifestyle. It's not unconventional to kind of rebel from your parents, but it does show kind of a rebellious spirit in the guy. And he was sick. Remember, he had the TB that he was dealing with.
I think he used the
All right, can we go on?
No. Jekyll like a really popular name?
I've never heard the name, ever. There's a Jekyll Island in Georgia. That's a very popular place. I don't know who that's named after. It's the only other time I've ever heard that. When I was a kid, there was a cartoon of two magpies. They're birds, Heckle and Jekyll. I mean, those are literally the only three places I've ever heard the name, context of the name. That doesn't mean it may be more popular than we think. And notice the name Hyde is spelled with a Y, which is how you would, but it sounds like it's spelled with an I. So that's a play on words that he uses.
Hyde.
Right.
He's hiding.
But there's another definition for the word hide, H-I-D-E.
Skin.
Yeah, of what? Animals. Just thought I'd say that, because I think that is implied here as well, that meaning.
What does Jekyll stand for? What does Jekyll stand for?
Right. He marries the woman who divorced, so I mean that was sort of unconventional. Publishes Treasure Island, the year before Huck Finn is published, and which was inspired by a map he made with his stepson, which I think is really a cool way to be inspired. You know, and it is a child, sort of a youth book, which is the audience that he primarily appealed to. He travels and meets Henry James, who was a greater writer than Stevenson. Henry James is probably considered a better writer, more weighty, significant. And then 1886, just a couple years after Huck Finn is published, he publishes this book, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, somebody was talking about Queen Victoria. Who is it? Yeah. Do you know when she became queen? It's not a. I do not know the answer. It's not a. I'm not trying to test you. I'd like to know.
No. Sometime during the when Germany and Austria were, or not, when Austria and Hungary were fighting. Sometime around then.
1837.
Yeah.
1837. 63. How long has Queen Elizabeth been queen?
Her life. Entire life.
She's the long. Before Queen Elizabeth, Victoria was the longest reigning monarch. She was queen for 63 years. Elizabeth has been queen for 70 years. This is her 70th year.
I feel like I've been crying.
And she's in her 90s, so she was in her early 20s when she
Isn't that
became.
even like her son around 10 years? How is she still alive?
She's
Well, she's not
She's
that
been
old.
girl.
I mean, we have a 97-year-old man living with us. So it's not like the rarest thing in the world to be 90, and I don't know how old women. I don't know how old she is.
She's still reigning.
She better stay alive
She's
until her son
95.
dies, because I don't.
Thank you.
Her
95.
son.
He's the one that married Diana. That'd be fine.
Yeah.
Isn't he going like?
You know, she's not, she's a reigning
Yeah.
monarch, but she doesn't do much
Yeah.
reigning.
It directly
It's
killed
it's
Diana.
very ceremonial.
And he married Camilla, and
That probably
Yeah.
helps. Victoria was a reigning monarch. Although she had a
Diana was
parliament
murdered.
as well. All right, ladies, y'all are finished, right?
Yes. I refuse to believe that Diana was not murdered.
it was an accident.
Okay.
And then finally, as far as biography is concerned, he, late in his life, when did I say he died? When did he die? The year? All right, so the last 6 years of his life, he basically sails the South Pacific. Why the South Pacific? Because of the climate. He settles in Samoa. There's a British Samoa. There's an American Samoa. And he actually campaigns for Samoan rights, which is this is kind of interesting. And he's buried there. So if you want to go to Scotland, Edinburgh, you'll see monuments maybe to him, but you won't see his gravesite. You have to go to the British Samoa to see his gravesite. There's an American Samoa. Did you know? I'm sure you'd be fascinated with this trivia. That per capita, you know what I mean, in terms of the population, the American Samoa has produced more NFL football players than any place in America. And it is American. It's a territory. It's not a state. But anyway, that's where he died. He's buried to this day.
Spirit just gives him power. Football power.
Well, that's the American Samoa. This is
Oh.
British Samoa. But I imagine they're not that different, the two types of people. You know, the guy that does a commercial, I never can remember his name. I think he's Samoan. He does a commercial for hair. He had real long, he played for the Steelers, he had real long hair. And he does it's a shampoo commercial. I think he's from Samoa.
Or I like shoes.
All right, can we go on?
No.
All right. I'm sure we're almost finished. Okay, these probably the more important information. His reputation has fluctuated during the century. In other words, his stock as a writer has gone up and it's gone down. It says some have idolized him, and here's an SAT word: hagiography. It's a biography of a saint or a venerated person. So a hagiography would be a writing that praises someone. It doesn't have to be a saint, but treats the person like a saint. Like it's a work of praise for somebody. It could be considered a hagiography. He wrote stories that were popular with readers, but especially young readers. The AP really doesn't recognize Stevenson as writing books that are worth writing on the AP about. And so my students are allowed to pick any book for one of the essays, but I've warned them, and I need to warn them again, that's why we don't read this book in AP until after the exam. You can't use it. Because you get to pick a book, and he's not considered essay worthy. So youth literature is a relatively low prestige category. So if the Twilight series and those kinds of things, if the audience is primarily for youth, if it's kind of a youth book, it's not considered great literature. But doesn't mean it's not popular, or you can make a lot of money writing it, or enjoy reading. And as a result, he's not taken as seriously as a writer as Joseph Conrad, who will write the last book we read. In fact, in about 2 weeks, we'll start reading it, and it's the shortest book we'll read, I think. It may not be. It's two different fonts. It's hard to tell, but they're basically the same length. It's called Heart of Darkness. We will read that one. It'll be one of the hardest books you'll ever read. What makes it hard to read? I'll get to that later. All right, Henry James, who you probably don't know, he is a more respected writer than this guy. Popular, but not respected at the same level as some of these other people. So what does he write about? Well, let's talk about this book. He supposedly dreamed it. It has 64,000 words in it, or at least he wrote the first 64,000. I don't know how much it's turned out to be, but he wrote it in 4 days. I have been writing, I've told you I've been writing something, and I have 55,000 words. It's taken me 2 years. I don't write on it. It's not my day job. But I haven't even gotten up to the length of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde yet. The story takes place in London, but has a lot of references to Scotland. Most cities have the good side of town, the nice side of town, the respectable side of town, and the not so respectable side of town. Every city's got those places that you'd need to be careful at night, because they're usually bars and maybe worse than that. So you would want to be careful if you went to that side of town. And in the South, sometimes it was referred to as the other side of the tracks. You ever heard that expression? You know, literally the train tracks split, say maybe a southern town into two sections. Well, all cities have that. Edinburgh had it, the old town and the new town. And so does London. London has that. And Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde has that. There's a less respectable side of town and then a more respectable side of town. Just like Dr. Jekyll is respectable, Mr. Hyde is not. In some ways, you could talk about Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer as being a double. They are very much alike, but also different. All right, so here, I want you to write these characters down. There's just a handful of them. It's a short novel that some people call a novelette, which some people don't like that expression, that term. But Dr. or Mr. Utterson, he's not the narrator, so that's a misstatement. He doesn't narrate the book, but it is like Red Badge of Courage. We see the book through Dr. Utterson's eyes. He is not the main characters. Obviously, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the main characters, but it is through his eyes that we hear the story of Jekyll and Hyde. And then we actually get a chapter by Dr. Jekyll. So he's a friend to Jekyll and Mr. Enfield. Enfield's a very minor character. Who is he? He's just a friend of Utterson. The first time we see Mr. Hyde, the first time we hear about it, Enfield and Utterson are together. Do you see anything interesting about the name Utterson? The name. What is the word utter mean? Like, I think of a cow, but that's not the definition I'm looking for. Like you utter, you speak. So I think that's significant. He's a lawyer, and he's the one who kind of, he's the balancing force in the book. Dr. Jekyll is a well-known, respected London doctor, medical doctor. Mr. Hyde is Jekyll's alter ego, which means the double there again. He's sort of his opposite. He's cruel, he's malicious, he's selfish, he's cowardly, he's corrupt, he's immoral, he's violent. Dr. Jekyll is respectable, well-liked, successful, educated, wealthy. And then you have Dr. Hasty, interesting name, Lanyon, once Jekyll's closest friend. So he was Jekyll's friend, he being a doctor, they had a lot in common. But he is no longer in the book. He one time he was, and the book doesn't take place over a very long period of time, but it is a period of months. And they skip over that part really quickly, the part. So it seems like it happens in a short period of time. Coleridge supposedly dreamed, what is that book? Kubla Khan. And this guy supposedly dreamed this book. Though maybe your dreams can be lucrative sometime. Okay, can I move on? All Alright, so characteristics and themes. It is a novelette. Some people call it that. Some people don't like that term. But it's a long work of fiction, but shorter than a normal novel and longer than your typical short story. Short stories are supposed to be written at one sitting. And you could do that with Jekyll and Hyde, but it's, you know, people's attention span is not that great. So it's not as long as most novels. 64,000 words, and maybe actually is longer than that. I don't know if it is. I don't know what the final number is. And it's part of the theme of it is the double, where a character has literally another character that's like him in some significant ways and different. Poe wrote a book called William Wilson, where this guy goes to a what do you call it, a boarding school, and this new kid comes to visit. He comes not visit, he comes to school, and he looks just like him, and he acts just like him. There's some differences. I've read it, but I can't remember all the details, but it's like, he's just like me, you know. Dostoevsky's The Double, I've never read that, but Crime and Punishment, I don't get that. The Double, what's that? Well, they're two sides of Raskolnikov. That's the main character in Crime and Punishment. That may not be something you would ever imagine you're reading. I really think it would be interesting. It's called Crime and Punishment. It's a long book, but it takes place in Russia. But if you had to read something like that, like Dostoevsky, or if you had to read a Russian novel, that's really good. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Have you ever read that or seen it? What do you know about it, Isabel?
Isn't it like he has a painting and like he never ages with painting them or something?
Yes.
Or like, yeah.
Yes, and it has some supernatural. Did you read it or see a movie?
No, I just know about it.
Okay. Well, it is about a work of art, so that you like that. Anyway, Picture of Dorian Gray, Joseph Conrad's Secret Sharer. This guy shows up, he floats up to a boat in the middle of the ocean, and he's half alive, he's half dead, and the captain hides him in his cabin, and so he's almost like his double, his brother, whatever. And we're almost there. I don't know if there's another one or not. We'll get this one. The vocabulary, we'll start reading on Monday. Let me see what's next after Isabel. I just want to check it to see if there are any more. Okay. We don't have time for this, so we'll come to it on Monday. And I hope you have a good weekend.
As a publication of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, his murder spree band, he influenced Jack the Ripper.
You know anything about Jack the Ripper?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
What do you know?
He killed a bunch of prostitutes, and
Who was he?
no one knows.
That's right. No one knows.
It was
I was
me.
just-
But yeah, this is literally just the plot of Spider-Man. My earring.
He dismembered the body. On that happy note, we'll see you.
Yeah.
I know murder things.
This is Spider-Man. This is literally just
I
Spider-Man.
know unsolved crime.